Welcome back. Now for a look back at local and national political headlines that we saw in 2014. And let's start on the national, Ellis, because Democrats didn't think things were going to go well this time in the midterms. But I don't think they thought it was going to go as bad. Lost a whole bunch of seats in the Senate, losing control. The margins got even bigger at the House level. If you had to attribute it to something, is it just, you think, the regular cycle, how things are supposed to go, or was it something more than that?
Well, I mean, mostly it's that we don't like our leaders, right? And when they stick around a while, we especially don't like them. And to me, this brings up the question of what do we do in this new reality? And I got to tell you, I'm a whole lot less despondent today than I was right after the election, because Dems may actually be thinking of some ideas. They've been pretty busy this last month or so,
Yep,
right?
Absolutely. The president has at least given an idea that the last 2 years won't just be, hitting the snooze button with lame duck status. But Andrew, if you attributed the big Democratic failure, sure, I think Ellis hit it on the head. There's always a fatigue factor with the party in power. That said, though, there's already a lot of Monday morning quarterback, and maybe the president should have done something different. Maybe it should have been about a fight about ideas, not just, well, you know what, it could be worse.
Yeah, except the Monday morning quarterbacking after Democrats lose always seems to be the same quarterbacking. I mean, it's the same thing after 2000 when Al Gore wouldn't campaign with Bill Clinton because, they thought that people weren't going to like Clinton, so I'm not going to hang around with him. Or 2010, Democrats didn't want to run on health care reform, so they ran away from it and it hurt them. Democrats are pretty feckless when they think it's going to be a negative cycle, and they try to disassociate themselves with their leaders and their policies that they have really beholden themselves to in the years leading up to it. I think Democrats did a terrible job of clinging to their agenda and clinging to their president, and they could have changed people's minds. Republicans, when faced with public opinion that's against them, work to change people's minds. Democrats run from the public opinion that's negative. And I think Democrats ran themselves into a loss in November.
But Richard, let's remember, this president played a big role in other Democrats running from him. I mean, he made it clear that he was not going to have any coattails this election year. I mean, I know we're going into a new year in just a couple of hours, but let's rewind and remember the disaster, if you will, of the healthcare rollout. I mean, a total disaster with the computer system. And those that had faith in the system, that believed that this president, going back to your point, elected on change, this president that's now rocking the boat, and some will say perhaps in a good way, it was a total disaster, in which we saw his Health and Human Services Secretary step down in terms of the rollout, not just on health care. Let's also remember ISIS. I know it seems like a thing of the past now, but remember when the president, and there are those that say he had conflicting messages that perhaps was not for the public, but for some others, for Secretary of State Kerry, of some others. But when he stood up there and said the U.S. didn't have a policy as it related to ISIS, major errors.
And yet healthcare is doing well. Enrollment is up.
Right.
The rates are going down, or at least they're not going up as much. More people are being covered. And even with ISIS, some big victories recently against militants in Iraq. So, they haven't run well on them, and they've been unpopular from the start, and yet the policies overall seem to be doing well.
Do you think, Jeannie, because as we talked before, you know the numbers here, Republicans actually poll worse than Democrats here as both the brand but also congressional Republicans. They become the party of no. Do you think there's a misread maybe on their part after November to say, hey, people voted for us rather than they voted against the incumbent?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big danger for the Republicans, is to think they have some kind of mandate going forward and they're going to be able to fulfill that. And I think these last 5 weeks, as Ellis mentioned, have been testament to the fact that when the president does what his convictions tell him he should do, in fact, things are not so bad for him or the Democrats. And one of the things I think is a real lesson of this year is that you cannot govern based on polls. You've got to do what you believe is the right thing to do. And public opinion usually follows along. The public can be fickle. It takes them a little while to catch up to what's going on. But the president, I think, as an example, made a big mistake when he decided to put off immigration for the third, fourth, fifth time in order to help red state Democrats who he couldn't help. Yep. And in fact, he ended up losing Colorado, potentially the governorship of Florida. So, you have to stick to your convictions, and that's what leadership is about. And I think the president is just starting to embrace that. And unfortunately, he's embracing it in his last 2 years. And so, you hope the next president, Republican or Democrat, takes that lesson to heart.
on the regional level here, Ellis, Governor Cuomo won, but I don't think it was out without some of the bruising that came along the way. It wasn't by the margin that he expected here. At the end of the day, do you think that the governor would have signed up for the final tally, or do you think that he was going to run up the score, or he thought he was going to run up the score more than he did?
You know, it's funny. I mean, it was still a pretty solid victory, but you're right. It feels kind of like a deflating defeat. I think a lot of it was just that he turned out to be kind of a bad candidate. Right? He hid from the public. He wouldn't engage with the opponents. And when he was out on the trail, he just seemed flat. What did his book sell? 12 copies or 13
I
copies?
think, yeah.
And that was the thing that was going to propel him, right?
Somebody just returned the 13 bags.
It's going right. It could be going back in the other direction. It just kind of felt like, for a victory, it sure felt like a flop.
He won another term, and he won it pretty convincingly. But if you took his brand and compared where we are on December 31st, 2014 to where his brand was on December 31st, 2013, he was a much better brand a year ago. He showed a lot. He took a lot of hits from his left. The challenge from Zephyr Teachout actually dented his status, I think, with a lot of people. He was late to the party on a couple of key issues that came after the election, that being casinos and fracking. And he seemed somewhat aloof and certainly very Andrew Cuomo oriented in terms of all of his decisions. It seemed like they were designed to benefit him primarily, New York secondarily. So I think his brand has taken a beating in 2014.
But I guess I'll be the one to defend the governor.
For the first time, go ahead, yeah.
But it was still a convincing win. It may not have met expectations from some, but he still won convincingly, and he did nothing to hurt a potential presidential run. It has always been my contention that he is not a presidential candidate. There's just no way in the world. And with all indications that Hillary is going to run, that means a no-go for Governor Cuomo. But still a convincing win. And let's face it, Rob Astorino, he may not have done the best job of getting his message out, and he didn't have the war chest to back that up, the campaign dollars, but he was a pretty good candidate.
I'll start with you, and then I can tell you another story that dominated headlines, whether it was coming out of Trenton, or whether it's coming out of Albany, or where. A lot of politicians getting in trouble. And if you want to talk about a cynical public, right? They're cynical because, for good reason sometimes. The headlines about whether it's graft, whether it's bribery, whether it's people, trying to fix this, fix that. I mean, there seemed to be a perp walk every other week in Albany, Dom.
That's a good way to put it. Ongoing situation as it relates to the legislature in New York. It does seem to be an indictment just about every other month. Christie, by all indication, the governor of New Jersey, there is no direct evidence that as of now, as of tonight, as of this moment, that he had,
tomorrow.
right, but check again tomorrow that he had any involvement. But it does seem to be one of the major headlines of the year. I mean, one of us predicted that corruption is a major problem with the New York State legislature.
Every year. You can make that prediction every year.
Way to go out on a limb there, Dom.
Wow.
But right? I mean, that feeds into that same cynicism. I mean, literally, some of the craziest ones that you'll hear of too, but it's not just somebody whose name you never heard of. I mean, you had people that, were actually players here who got in a lot of trouble this year, and the Moreland Commission certainly didn't do any favors to that imagery as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the most difficult aspects of this is that it's the things that are legal, both in Albany and in Trenton, that are the most shocking. So you're absolutely right, or as Dominic predicted last year, as he told us, there's a lot of corruption, a lot of perp walks, but it's the things that are legal, that are allowed. And I have to give the Times credit for following up this Moreland Commission story, because it's boring, it's hard to swallow and understand, but it's those things that we allow in our system that have to be addressed. And how do you get people animated and energized to go out to the polls to vote on that? I mean, look at the turnout in New York this time around. Governor Cuomo was reelected, but let's not forget what percentage of the New York public reelected him. It's a very small margin.
Well, when we come back here, I want to talk about, we'll get more into the Bridgegate, Moreland, but other regional issues that define this year. And in fact, speaking of Bridgegate, we could be getting indictments coming in a matter of weeks, and also some big changes in New Jersey. You could have sports betting here. What about even, where's that going to all go? We'll get into all those issues and much more straight ahead.